Alright, let's read this. In a wide-ranging interview, city on Gaza's southern border with Egypt is thought to currently have some 1.4 million people in it. According to the UN, many Palestinians fled there from somewhere else in the territory amid the ongoing war sparked by Hamas's October 7th terror attack. We have been clear in multiple conversations and in every way that any major military operation in Rafah would be a huge mistake, Harris told ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott in part of the interview that aired Sunday on This Week. Let me tell you something. I have studied the maps. There's nowhere for those folks to go, Harris said. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said earlier this month he'd approved a plan to invade Rafah, an announcement that prompted President Joe Biden to relay what the White House called deep concerns about the safety of many civilians sheltering in the city. Tens of thousands of people have died in Gaza so far, according to the Hamas-run health ministry there. Oh, my hand. Netanyahu has maintained that going into Rafah is necessary to dismantle Hamas in the wake of their attack. Israel forces also insist they can move civilians out of the battleground and toward humanitarian islands, but the U.S., which is a major supporter of Israel's military, has sharply criticized the possibility of a large-scale incursion. Scott, on Sunday, pressed the vice president, asking if America would consider consequences if Netanyahu went forward, something he said he was willing to do despite the opposition. Well, we're going to take it one step at a time, but we've been very clear in terms of our perspective on whether or not that should happen, Harris said. Scott followed up, "Are you ruling out that there would be consequences from the United States?" "I am ruling out nothing," Harris replied. Wow. It sounds like they want to freeze on this. It sucks, but it's like it really feels like the civilian lives are really the priority here. That's definitely something people are trying to understand right now, is that there is Hamas, and then there's these Palestinian civilians. It reminds me a lot of just, as a casual news consumer, it just reminds me a lot of the Afghan war narrative, where it was very clear that there was a line drawn between Al-Qaeda and Afghani soldiers. People want information about where these things are happening. Clearly, they're willing to consider figures from Hamas-run ministries, but it is hard to say what you could do in this situation that wouldn't cost incredible civilian casualties. Incredible magnitudes of civilian casualties. Sorry. I'm not really sure who the decision makers here are, so it's really hard to say whose interests are at stake, but it sounds severe. It definitely sounds severe. "I'm ruling out nothing," Harris replies. In the interview, Harris was also asked about Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's call for new elections in Israel, which Netanyahu decried as wholly inappropriate, meddling in his country's politics. Biden has not echoed Schumer's position, but did praise the senator's overall comments as a good speech. Harris told Scott on This Week, that "I will not speak for Senator Schumer, but we are very clear that that is on the Israeli people to make a decision about when they will have an election and who, of course, they elect to lead their government. That's for them to say. You know, it'd be really hard to justify a pro-Israel rally if people understood this as something the people were going through. I think when you look at the amount of force that's applied to this area of the world, it really falls on the Palestinian people more often than not. If you look at the kind of structural damage and collateral civilian casualties, it's really hard to argue that you need to or should support these people who are pushing this war forward, you know, people on the ground. I get the impression that while this is very much focused on the Palestinian people, the effect of these actions falls more on people at home. I think it's, you can't really say one way or another because, you know, suddenly it becomes like a heartland issue. But these protests at home could easily spark major violence against a protected group which has for the past century faced some of the harshest scrutiny from either side of the aisle, from the majority powers that exist in the United States. And of course I am talking about the Jewish people of the United States. It's falling on them when it comes from this angle. And it would be terrible to see so many people who are separate from the issue suddenly become targets where it's just not necessary. It prompts a certain kind of defensiveness, and maybe we could see some movement from Israel if powers at home were willing to understand that this could become worse if they're not willing to pull a foot back for Palestine here. Let's see. Scott asked Harris if she thought Netanyahu was an obstacle to peace, as Schumer said. I believe that we have got to continue to enforce what we know to be and should be the priorities. Sorry, let me start that one more time. I believe that we have got to continue to enforce what we know to be and should be the priorities in terms of what is happening in Gaza, Harris said without directly answering the question. We've been very clear that far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Innocent Palestinians have been killed. We have been very clear that Israel and the Israeli people and Palestinians are entitled to an equal amount of security and dignity. Separately addressing a domestic issue, Harris would not rule out executive action to tackle the high number of migrants at the southern border. The president has been considering tightening asylum restrictions, ABC News previously reported. That's a nightmare. I saw this the other day. I gotta go into my archive here for a second. This was jarring. This was really jarring. Oh my. Where is it? Please ignore this. It's in a conversation with someone. Well, of course, there's this. There's this. What? But there's just something more disturbing that I saw that I thought needed to be said at some point. The IDF leaves cans of fake food out. Bomb bombs disguised as food. This is from Bosnia. Well, it period relevant. This is the kind of destruction that people are coming from. When people have to epitomize their life from what they can perceive, they're looking at the deterioration, the rapid, the instantaneous deterioration of life around them. And I think it stands to say that it's not unprecedented that an individual's actions can change another individual's lives. I don't want to say that it's a good thing that asylum has become, like, asylum restrictions have become stricter, but we have to understand that these are people who pick up a can of food off the ground and have it blow up in their face. This is the kind of psychological warfare that's used to spark inspiration for more violence from people who never needed to face it. It becomes this fixture in people's minds that even the food could be desecrated with justification. And so suddenly mixing these groups of people, mixing support and these groups of people becomes a trauma issue. You're talking about systematic injustice. You're talking about systematic oppression in the form of justification of further advances based on the actions of civilians that are being perpetuated by the system that seeks to advance it through this trauma. I understand, but it is one of those issues that's so far out of my grasp that I hazard to say that I just don't know, and I have to accept it right now. Polling shows Biden gets low marks on immigration, which is a top issue for many Americans. Republicans have continued to hammer away at the president over the border, and see, this just goes back to the protests, like I was saying. Though Harris maintained that Congress has the immense power and authority and responsibility to address it, after conservative lawmakers recently failed to agree on a bipartisan immigration deal in the Senate, she also said the Biden administration is going to do what we can. People end up in racial ghettos. Palestinian racial ghettos are in flames, emotionally, metaphorically in flames right now. The last thing people need is more, eye for an eye politics, and turning these small communities into sites of great racial injustice. I think if we look at Mexico right now, Mexico City is running out of water. I think this is the fact that his immigration bill seems to be getting held up in the Senate. Well, what do you have to say about Mexicans today? And this is what I understand. People in Mexico are being dehydrated. They're being completely dehydrated right now. They have to resort to drastic measures to stay alive right now. And of course, people want to come to the U.S. in the hope of better lives, in the hope of pursuing, agriculture and education, as they have for the past century. And it really hurts me that people can suddenly focus on something that's so statistically stringent as the Gaza Strip and then turn it into this narrative to be anti-Mexican. Where there's already a culture in California of accepting these people and understanding that the honest way works. And I hate to see what they're doing to my brother. These bad actors on the ground, random boys, would go out impersonating Mexican people. And I just ran into one on Twitter. I just had to report that account. They had to rename their account to Crazy Pottery because it used to be, Pottery Loca, impersonating a Mexican girl online. These white supremacists do not stop at the Senate. These boys are out of control. And they would take examples like this and reduce them. Like I explained to you, they would use this reductive thinking to create these false dichotomies, these false comparisons, especially in the area of mental health, to perpetuate violence where it is necessary. Because where do these guys get all their information? Social media. They get it from on high. You saw it with Andrew Dymock. Nothing was happening on an otaku board. These are people with very specific interests who stay in those interests for a reason. And the first people to have the resources and the motivation to turn this place into an alt-right breeding ground are white supremacists. I'm tired of feeling it. This is why my finger's broken right now. These kids are running wild. And it's just too much. It destroys democracy. And I hazard to think what kind of new paramilitary products, new paramilitary contracts are creeping up from the dark side of the United States of America right now, because I'm feeling it at home. The directed energy weapon does not help. As of right now, is that executive action on the border still on the table? Scott asked. Can we see that? Harris initially pointed back to Capitol Hill, saying this does not absolve the fact that the real fix is going to be when Congress acts. When Scott pressed again, the vice president said yes, for consideration. The interview took place at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. The interview took place at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the site of the Valentine's Day mass shooting in 2018 that killed 17 students and staff. Harris was visiting the school, which remains an active crime scene, with some of the victims' families. What happened here 6 years ago is tragic by every measure, Harris told Scott. She later said it was important that she visited the school to give witness to how gun violence in America affects real people. We have to think of this as more than statistics, and we certainly have to understand that we should have empathy that requires us to know this can't be the subject of political gamesmanship, the vice president said. Yeah. It's about applying the knowledge. She said, 4 years. She said there were reasonable, 3 years and a few months. Okay. She said there were reasonable measures that could be taken to tackle gun violence, including so-called red flag laws that a 2022 law provided further state. She said there were reasonable measures that could be taken to tackle gun violence, including so-called red flag laws that a 2022 law provided further state funding to implement. You're done. But as Scott noted, only 6 states have used that money. That's why it's been a challenge, Harris said. I'm going to assume that they need a little motivation, and hopefully we've been able to bring it to them. Harris and President Biden ramped up their travel in recent weeks ahead of an expected general election rematch with former President Donald Trump, but both of them have yet to commit to debating Trump or his future running mate. Who am I debating? Harris said to Scott. If you're comparing yourself to the alternative, that is really the crux of a lot of what the Biden campaign message is. Isn't there a case to be made that the best way to do that is to go out on the debate stage? Scott asked Harris. Well, we'll get to that at some point, but you're certainly right. But you're absolutely right. The vice president said this election in November is binary.